I'm a liberal. I grew up in a left-wing household in South Africa in the 1980s. To my parents, firearms were associated with, on the one hand, the police and military of what was a racist and, let's be honest, fascist state. A military I was likely to be conscripted into at some point, and a police and intelligence force that had at various times opened our mail, investigated my parents, assassinated dissidents, engaged in torture, and so forth. And on the other hand, the forces of the anti-apartheid struggle who, while fighting in a just cause, engaged in abuses of their own, and would not have had any qualms about me being collateral damage in one of their operations. So stuck between these poles, my parents adopted a deeply pacifist attitude, influenced, no doubt, by my maternal grandfather, who had served with distinction in the war, but who so hated the idea of it that he refused to talk about his experiences and was deeply scornful of those who did, and my father's miserable experiences as a conscript. Their attitudes, born out of a concern for those around them and a desire to see the flourishing of what was best and most noble in humanity, are with me still, and I'm deeply committed to the idea that people have a right to possess arms with as little state interference as practically possible. I'm committed to this idea because I'm a liberal, not in spite of it. In fact, I'm always surprised and dismayed when others who identify as liberal/progressive/whatever are opposed to the idea. I'm surprised and dismayed a lot. Being a liberal is about ensuring that each person can choose their own goods and life goals, and that we should be able to pursue those goods without interference, and that the actions of the state should be oriented around ensuring that the right to pursue them should be as free as possible, exercised freely without interference, or whether it be interference from the state, interference from other people, or interference from the fact that one is poor, or of some or other race, or has had shitty healthcare or education in one's past. Now, I don't have a firearms license, which is required to possess one in South Africa, partly because of my upbringing, and partly because the process is such a long bureaucratic nightmare. So I made the decision at pretty much every point not to do so. And the key part of that sentence, though, is I made the decision. Part of the reason I decided to shoot this video is because so much of the discussion about firearms rights is very US-centric, and this occurs in a very specific socio-political environment. The Second Amendment to their constitution, for example, carries a weight that it can't in the rest of the world. And I wanted to talk about the issue separate from that, looking at just those things that are common to many countries. That being said, a lot of my examples do come from there, given that A, it's a nexus for firearms discussion, and B, so much of the internet is US-centric. In this discussion, there are a number of different arguments taking place, and people of all persuasions tend to slip between them, and this obscures how each of the arguments works. The first argument has to do with the overall effect of firearms on violence, and the second on what the appropriate response is to that kind of effect. Again, because most discussions of firearms are about the US, I'll start there. I'll let you into something that almost no one wants to admit about violence levels in the USA. They're low, like really, really low. Violence has been steadily declining in general for the past several hundred years. Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature is a good introduction to this. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but it's a decent look at the history. And in the US in particular, since the 1990s, it's dropped off precipitously. Why? Well, that's a complicated question. People have alternatives to feuding. There's increased economic integration and opportunity, greater commitment to liberalism and human rights. Those are all certainly part of the big long-term picture. What about the violence in America? Well, firstly, it's a huge country with a bucket load of people in it, so you do expect some violence to happen. It's just part of the human condition. Scale it to, 300 million people? Add a highly integrated media that loves drama and controversy, it'll have a psychological effect disproportionate to its actual rate. And that's one of the downsides of the information revolution. Unprecedented freedom to speak and know and, ideally, overcome information asymmetry. But it sometimes feeds a media culture that itself often feeds ignorance and fear, rather than the kind of ideal of a liberal democratic state based on an informed populace. As just one example, Mark Waugh at the University of Texas has some very informative comments on the subject, and if I remember, I'll put a link in an interview with him down in the description. This is not limited to the US. According to this year's South African crime statistics, murder was down. But the media narrative and public hand-wringing was that it was up. As an explanation, the raw number was up, but the population was up even more, so there's a per capita decline. And assuming we can trust the government figures, there's been a steady decline in violence for a number of years, but not a corresponding decline in perception of crime. And this applies, of course, to many, many countries. Something else that applies to both South Africa and the US. While we both have violence levels that are higher than some other countries, much of this is extremely concentrated. So for most of the US and some parts of South Africa, rates of violent crime are on a par with or lower than a number of first world countries with very low violence rates. So the argument that increasing violence in either country requires an increasingly restrictive legislative response doesn't hold any water at all. So if violence rates are not just not rising but actually falling, and they probably weren't that high to begin with in historical terms, then what's the problem? Well, one problem, and the one that gun control advocates tend to trot out in the US and South Africa, is that of dramatic crimes. It should be pretty clear to everyone that this is a purely rhetorical strategy. Despite opportunistic claims by politicians and media figures, that so-called mass shootings are occurring more frequently, they're simply not. And the focus on those, or on Oscar Pistorius, or whoever, frankly keeps people's attention away from those areas in which violence is a real systemic problem. So what about those areas? There are bits of this country and bits of the US, Brazil, many other countries, where violence is a day-to-day reality that many people in shitty economic circumstances cannot escape. What are our responsibilities to those parts of our various societies? And I believe absolutely as part of my liberalism that there are real public goods and real tragedies of the commons, and that there are appropriate society-wide responses to them that we can't morally opt out of. Well, the first thing to look at in this context is the data on firearms as a causal factor in violence. And the answer is there's simply nothing there. Or rather, we can't distinguish the effect from zero. And if we could, we sure as hell have no idea which direction it would be in. There are times and places where rises in violence have gone with rises in firearm ownership. But in those places, the rise in violence tends to come first, and the rise in firearms ownership later. So the rise in violence drives the firearm ownership, not the other way around. But on a large scale, regional stats for violence versus firearms ownership within the US and between nations shows that they're pretty much orthogonal to each other. In other words, neither one is the cause of the other in general. So what does cause violence? Well, we have a pretty good idea of that. Shitty economic prospects, high Gini coefficient, lack of a sense of membership in the broader political community, lack of a sense of loyalty from the broader political community, lack of trust in the judicial process, alienation, a system that rewards illegal behavior, cough, war on drugs, cough. These perpetrators of violence are not that irrational. They see violence as a method of bettering their lives. Wouldn't it be awesome if they had other options? And that's one of the things that has most frustrated me about the most recent round of discussions in the US and South Africa. The focus on middle-class white kids and photogenic models as some kind of talisman, on freak tragedies that, yes, tear families and communities apart, but not the systemic problems. Why? Because systemic problems are embarrassing. They suggest that one's country is more flawed than one may want to believe, that the land of opportunity or the rainbow nation is not a reality for a lot of people, and because solving real problems is really, really hard. Making noise about an easy target like firearms isn't hard at all. There's something the public can latch their imaginations to, and this can be used to conceal betrayals of true liberal principles, the principles that were promised to us. Betrayals like bailouts of big finance in the US, maladministration and nepotism in South Africa. So, in summary, firearms have At worst, an immeasurably small causal effect on violence. Violence is a systemic problem in certain communities, and focusing on singular, horrible events because of media buzz is a nasty, racist attempt to deflect attention from the real causes, because those causes are embarrassing, and because certain useless symbolic actions look good. More's coming in the next video.